Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through the mists of medieval history. Tonight, we're traveling back nearly 1,000 years to witness one of the most transformative stories ever told. Whether you're settling in for the evening or simply seeking refuge from the modern world, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet hour with us. The story I'm about to share isn't just about conquest and crowns. It's about a man whose very existence would reshape an entire civilization, forever altering the course of English history. This is the story of William the Conqueror, but more than that, it's the story of how one Norman duke's ambition transformed England from a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into something entirely new. By the time our journey ends, you'll understand how a bastard child from Normandy became the architect of modern English civilization itself. Let us begin in the year 1028 in the Duchy of Normandy, where our story opens not in a grand palace, but in the modest chambers of a young woman named Herleva. She was the daughter of a tanner from the town of Falaise, her hands still bearing the faint scent of the leather her family worked. On this particular morning, as autumn mist clung to the Norman countryside, Herleva was preparing for what would become the most consequential day of her life. Duke Robert of Normandy, known to history as Robert the Magnificent, had noticed the tanner's daughter during one of his frequent rides through Falaise. The attraction was immediate and intense, though their union would never be sanctified by the church. In the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Normandy, such relationships were common among the nobility, but the children born from them carried a burden that would follow them throughout their lives. When William entered the world in that fateful year of 1028, he bore the stigma that medieval society reserved for those born outside of marriage. The whispered word bastard would echo through his childhood like a constant shadow, shaping not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself. Yet from his earliest moments, there was something different about this child, something that suggested destiny had marked him for greatness. The Normandy of William's birth was a land caught between worlds. Less than 2 centuries earlier, Viking raiders had carved out this territory through blood and determination. These Norsemen, or Normans as they came to be known, had gradually adopted the French language and Christian faith, but they retained the warrior spirit and tactical brilliance that had made their ancestors the terror of medieval Europe. Duke Robert ruled this volatile duchy with an iron fist, but his court was far from the refined elegance we might imagine. The ducal residence at Rouen was a fortress first and a palace second, its great hall filled with the smoke of cooking fires and the constant murmur of armed men discussing matters of war and politics. Here, young William spent his earliest years, absorbing the lessons of power and survival that would serve him throughout his extraordinary life. Even as a small child, William displayed the intense focus and physical prowess that would define his character. While other noble children played at games, he studied the movements of his father's knights, memorizing their techniques and strategies. His tutors quickly discovered that this boy possessed an almost supernatural ability to absorb information, particularly anything related to warfare and governance. The daily routine of William's childhood was rigorous beyond what most modern minds could comprehend. He rose before dawn each morning, beginning his day with prayers in the cold stone chapel that adjoined the ducal residence. The Norman nobility took their Christian faith seriously, viewing it not as a mere formality, but as the foundation upon which all legitimate authority rested. For William, these early morning devotions became a source of inner strength that would sustain him through the trials ahead. After prayers came physical training that would have challenged grown men. Norman warriors were renowned throughout Europe for their skill with sword and lance, their ability to fight both mounted and on foot, and their mastery of the complex tactics required for medieval warfare. William threw himself into this training with an intensity that impressed even the most battle-hardened veterans of his father's guard. The boy's weapons master was a grizzled veteran named Turold, who had fought alongside Duke Robert in campaigns across France and into Italy. Turold recognized something special in his young pupil. a combination of natural athleticism and cold analytical intelligence that marked William as a born warrior. Under Turold's guidance, William learned not just how to wield a sword, but how to think like a general, considering every possible advantage and disadvantage before committing to action. But William's education extended far beyond the arts of war. Duke Robert, despite his own reputation for violence and ambition, understood that ruling a duchy required more than just martial skill. He ensured that his son received instruction in Latin, the language of the church and of diplomatic correspondence. William studied the great works of classical antiquity, learning from the examples of Caesar and Alexander how great leaders had conquered and held vast territories. The political landscape of William's childhood was one of constant danger and opportunity. The French monarchy, weakened by internal conflicts and the growing power of its great vassals, exercised only nominal control over duchies like Normandy. This created a situation where ambitious nobles could carve out independent kingdoms through skill and audacity. But it also meant that every duke lived under the constant threat of invasion from jealous neighbours. Duke Robert's court reflected this precarious balance between civilization and barbarism. During the day, the Great Hall might host learned discussions about theology or law, with clerks and scholars presenting complex arguments about the proper relationship between secular and religious authority. But as evening fell and wine flowed freely, the same hall would ring with the crude songs and violent boasts of men who had spent their lives taking what they wanted through force of arms. William observed all of this with the keen attention of a natural student of human nature. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a seemingly jovial conversation was about to turn deadly, when a casual insult might trigger a blood feud that would last for generations. These lessons in the complex dynamics of medieval court life would prove invaluable when he later faced the challenge of ruling not just Norman warriors, but the sophisticated and fractious nobility of conquered England. The question of William's legitimacy hung over his childhood like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. While Duke Robert openly acknowledged his son and treated him as his heir, the boy's bastard status provided a convenient excuse for any noble who might wish to challenge his authority. Medieval law was complex and often contradictory regarding inheritance rights, particularly when illegitimate children were involved. This uncertainty forced William to develop qualities that legitimate heirs might never need. He could not rely solely on the automatic respect that came with unquestioned royal blood. Instead, he had to earn loyalty through demonstrated competence, inspire fear through displays of strength, and maintain power through constant vigilance against potential challengers. These harsh lessons of his youth would shape him into a leader who trusted no one completely and who always prepared for the worst possible outcome. The Norman nobility who surrounded William during his formative years were a unique breed, combining Viking ruthlessness with continental sophistication. These were men whose grandfathers had sailed the northern seas as raiders, but who now styled themselves as Christian knights and patrons of learning. They built magnificent stone churches while simultaneously planning elaborate campaigns of conquest and plunder. Among these nobles, William learned the intricate code of honor and obligation that governed medieval society. A lord owed protection and justice to his vassals, while they owed him military service and unwavering loyalty. But these relationships were far more complex than simple contracts. They involved personal bonds forged through shared dangers, sealed by solemn oaths, and maintained through constant displays of mutual respect and trust. William's mother, Herleva, played a crucial role in shaping his character during these early years. Despite her humble origins, she possessed a keen intelligence and strong moral compass that impressed even the sophisticated nobles of Robert's court. She ensured that her son understood the importance of keeping his word, treating subordinates with fairness, and never forgetting the common people whose labor supported the entire feudal system. From Herleva, William learned that true strength came not from brutality, but from the ability to inspire others to follow willingly into danger. She taught him that even the mightiest duke was ultimately dependent upon the loyalty of farmers and craftsmen, soldiers and servants. This lesson would later influence William's approach to governing England, where he would prove more capable than most conquerors of winning the grudging acceptance of the conquered population. The religious atmosphere of William's childhood was intense and all-encompassing. The Norman Church, while nominally subject to papal authority, had developed its own distinctive character that reflected the warrior culture of the duchy. Norman bishops were often former soldiers who had taken holy orders later in life, and they preached a muscular Christianity that emphasized duty, courage, and the righteousness of fighting for just causes. William absorbed this religious worldview completely, developing a faith that was both deeply personal and intensely practical. He genuinely believed that God had chosen him for greatness, but he also understood that divine favor had to be earned through righteous action and careful preparation. This combination of spiritual confidence and practical caution would later enable him to undertake the seemingly impossible task of conquering England while maintaining his conviction that he was acting as God's instrument. As William grew from boy to young man, the violent realities of medieval politics began to intrude more directly upon his life. The Duchy of Normandy was surrounded by enemies who viewed its wealth and strategic position with envious eyes. The Count of Anjou pressed from the south, the King of France threatened from the east, and rebellious Norman barons plotted from within. Duke Robert's response to these challenges was characteristically direct and brutal, leading to a series of campaigns that would test both his military skill and his son's readiness to inherit power. The first time William accompanied his father on campaign, he was barely 12 years old, but already tall and strong for his age. The experience of seeing actual warfare, of watching men die violent deaths in service to political ambitions, completed his education in the harsh realities of medieval rulership. He learned that mercy was often a luxury that leaders could not afford, that hesitation in battle could doom entire armies, and that the price of maintaining power was eternal vigilance against those who would seize it for themselves. These early military experiences also revealed William's natural talent for leadership under pressure. Even as a youth, he displayed an uncanny ability to remain calm in chaotic situations, to quickly assess the tactical situation, and to inspire confidence in older, more experienced warriors. Veterans who had served his father for decades began to speak of the young bastard with a respect that transcended his questionable birth. Able birth. But it was not military prowess alone that would define William's character during these formative years. As he matured, observers began to notice something far more dangerous than mere physical courage. The boy possessed an analytical mind that could dissect complex political situations with surgical precision. Where other young nobles saw only glory and adventure in warfare, William saw patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities that could be exploited for long-term advantage. The daily rhythm of life in Duke Robert's court provided William with countless opportunities to study the intricate dance of medieval politics. Each morning, after his prayers and weapons training, he would position himself in the great hall where his father held court. Here, he watched as petitioners approached the ducal throne, each bringing their own agenda, their own carefully crafted version of truth. A typical morning might begin with a dispute between two minor nobles over grazing rights along their shared border. William observed how his father listened to both sides, asking pointed questions that revealed inconsistencies in their testimonies. He noted how the Duke's decision was influenced not just by the legal merits of the case, but by considerations of which family had provided more loyal service, which controlled more strategic territory, and which might pose a greater threat if their grievances remained unaddressed. These lessons in practical governance were invaluable, but they came at a cost that only William truly understood. Every decision his father made created new enemies or disappointed former allies. The weight of constant judgment, of knowing that every word might tip the balance between peace and war, began to etch lines of premature age across Duke Robert's face. William absorbed these observations with the keen attention of someone who knew he would soon face similar burdens. The afternoons were devoted to more formal education, though even here the focus remained intensely practical. William's tutors were not merely scholars, but men who had served in diplomatic missions to foreign courts. They taught him to read not just Latin texts, but the subtle language of gesture and tone that revealed a negotiator's true intentions. He learned that a slight hesitation before answering a question might indicate deception, that excessive courtesy often masked hostile intentions, and that the most dangerous enemies were those who smiled while plotting destruction. One of his most influential teachers was a monk named Lanfranc, who had gained renown throughout Europe for his scholarship and administrative abilities. Lanfranc recognized that William's quick mind was capable of grasping concepts that challenged much older students. Under his guidance, the young Duke's son delved into the complex relationships between secular and religious authority, studying how successful rulers had balanced their obligations to earthly vassals with their duties to divine law. Through Lanfranc's teaching, William developed a sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned in medieval society. He learned that true authority rested not on force alone, but on the complex web of obligations, traditions, and beliefs that bound different social classes together. A duke who relied solely on military strength might win battles, but he would ultimately fail to create the stable institutions necessary for lasting rule. The evenings in Duke Robert's court were perhaps the most educational of all, though in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. As wine flowed and tongues loosened, the carefully maintained facades of daylight hours would slip away, revealing the raw ambitions and bitter resentments that drove Norman politics. William learned to nurse his wine while others drank deeply, using their intoxication to gather intelligence about potential threats and opportunities. He discovered that the knight who had praised his father's wisdom during the morning court session harbored deep grievances about lands confiscated after a minor rebellion. He observed how seemingly loyal vassals would exchange meaningful glances when they thought no one was watching, coordinating positions that might later manifest as organized opposition. Most importantly, he learned that information gathered in these informal settings was often more valuable than anything revealed through formal diplomatic channels. The physical demands placed upon William during these years would have broken lesser men. His daily routine began before sunrise and rarely ended before midnight. After morning prayers and weapons training came hours of instruction in languages, law, and military strategy. The afternoon might bring actual combat training with seasoned knights, followed by administrative duties that taught him the practical skills of managing a duchy's complex finances and legal obligations. Yet perhaps the most challenging aspect of William's education was learning to navigate the constant undercurrent of violence that characterized Norman society. Disputes that might be resolved through legal proceedings in more peaceful times were settled through trial by combat or outright warfare. The young Duke's son had to master not just the skills necessary to survive these encounters, but the political judgment required to know when violence was necessary and when it might prove counterproductive. His first real test came when he was 14 years old, during a hunting expedition that turned into something far more dangerous. A group of minor nobles, emboldened by wine and long-standing grievances against Duke Robert's policies, decided to settle their differences with the ducal family through direct action. What began as casual conversation around the evening campfire gradually escalated into open challenges to William's legitimacy and his right to inherit his father's position. The situation was delicate beyond anything the young man had previously encountered. These were not foreign enemies who could be dealt with through straightforward military action, but Norman vassals whose loyalty was essential to the duchy's stability. Yet their challenge to his authority could not be ignored without appearing weak, which would only encourage more serious rebellions in the future. William's response revealed the political instincts that would later enable him to conquer and hold England. Rather than reacting with immediate anger or violence, he listened carefully to their complaints, acknowledging the legitimate grievances, while firmly rejecting any challenge to his father's authority. When words proved insufficient to diffuse the situation, he issued challenges to single combat, but structured them in ways that allowed his opponents to withdraw with minimal loss of face. The incident ended without bloodshed, but its lessons remained with William for the rest of his life. He had learned that the most dangerous enemies were often those closest to home, that legitimate grievances could be weaponized by ambitious rivals, and that successful leadership required the ability to project strength while offering face-saving alternatives to potential opponents. As news of William's handling of this crisis spread throughout Normandy, veteran nobles began to reassess their opinions of Duke Robert's bastard son. The boy, who had once been dismissed as an accident of ducal lust, was beginning to demonstrate qualities that marked him as a potential leader worthy of respect. His combination of physical courage, political intelligence, and carefully controlled ambition suggested that the duchy's future might be more secure than many had previously believed. But even as William's reputation grew within Normandy, events beyond the duchy's borders were shaping the larger political landscape in ways that would profoundly influence his destiny. The English throne, occupied by the Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, was becoming the center of increasingly complex succession disputes. Edward's lack of direct heirs meant that multiple claimants were positioning themselves to inherit the crown, and the Norman court was taking careful note of these developments. Duke Robert had maintained friendly relations with the English court for many years, based partly on family connections and partly on shared interests in containing the growing power of hostile neighbours. These relationships had provided young William with detailed knowledge of English politics and personalities, information that would prove invaluable when he later decided to press his own claim to the English throne. The religious dimension of these political calculations was especially important in an age when divine approval was considered essential for legitimate rule. William's education had emphasized the complex relationship between earthly and spiritual authority, teaching him that successful conquest required not just military victory, but also acceptance by the conquered population's religious leaders. Through his studies with Lanfranc and other church scholars, William developed a sophisticated understanding of how religious reform movements could be used to legitimize political change. He learned that presenting conquest as a mission to purify corrupt religious practices could transform what might otherwise appear as mere aggression into a righteous crusade blessed by divine authority. This knowledge would later prove crucial when William decided to invade England. His ability to present his campaign as an effort to reform English church practices and restore proper religious observance would help him gain papal support and legitimize his conquest in the eyes of European Christian opinion. The winter of 1042 brought changes that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of William's life. Duke Robert, perhaps recognizing his own mortality, or simply seeking to secure his son's inheritance, began making arrangements for a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Such journeys were common among medieval nobles who sought to demonstrate their piety while gaining spiritual benefits that might offset the violence necessary to maintain worldly power. But pilgrimages were also extremely dangerous undertakings that frequently ended in death from disease, accident, or hostile action. Before departing, Duke Robert needed to ensure that his duchy would remain stable and his son's inheritance would be protected during his absence. This required extracting oaths of loyalty from every major noble family, a process that revealed the complex web of obligations and rivalries that held Norman society together. William watched these preparations with the intense attention of someone whose entire future depended on their success. He observed how his father balanced threats and inducements to secure the necessary commitments, noting which nobles required additional persuasion and which seemed genuinely committed to honoring their oaths. These lessons in the practical mechanics of political loyalty would serve him well when he later faced similar challenges as a ruler in his own right. The day of Duke Robert's departure was marked by elaborate ceremonies that emphasized both the religious nature of his journey and the continuity of ducal authority during his absence. William, now 15 years old and approaching the age when medieval nobles typically assumed independent command, stood beside his father as the assembled nobility swore their oaths of allegiance. The weight of their expectations and the fragility of their promises would have overwhelmed a less prepared young man, but William's years of careful education had equipped him to understand exactly what these commitments meant and how they might be enforced. As Duke Robert's party disappeared into the morning mist, heading toward the ports that would carry them to the Holy Land, William began the most challenging period of his youth. He was not yet old enough to rule independently, but the Regency Council established to govern in his father's absence was composed of men whose loyalty was questionable and whose ambitions posed constant threats to his inheritance. The months that followed tested every skill William had developed during his intensive education. Rebellious nobles, encouraged by his youth and the temporary power vacuum created by his father's absence, began challenging ducal authority in ways they would never have dared while Robert remained in Normandy. William's response to these challenges would determine not just his immediate survival, but his fitness to inherit one of medieval Europe's most important duchies. Duchies. The young regent's first major crisis emerged from an unexpected quarter. Baldwin de Brion, one of Duke Robert's most trusted advisors, and a man who had sworn solemn oaths to protect William's interests, began showing signs of dangerous ambition. Baldwin controlled vast estates along Normandy's eastern border, commanded the loyalty of numerous knights, and possessed the military experience that William still lacked. More troubling still, he had begun hosting private gatherings at his castle, meetings that excluded William's supporters and focused on discussions of the duchy's uncertain future. William's spies, a network of servants and minor nobles who owed their positions to ducal favor, brought disturbing reports of these gatherings. Baldwin was not openly challenging William's right to inherit, but he was raising questions about whether such a young ruler could effectively protect Norman interests against the growing threats from neighboring territories. These seemingly reasonable concerns masked a more dangerous agenda. As Baldwin began positioning himself as the natural choice to serve as William's guardian and chief advisor, the situation required delicate handling that tested every lesson William had absorbed during his years of political education. Direct confrontation with Baldwin would likely trigger the very rebellion that the older man seemed to be orchestrating. But allowing these discussions to continue unchallenged would signal weakness and encourage more ambitious nobles to join what might become an unstoppable coalition against ducal authority. William's response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that would later enable him to manipulate far more complex political situations. Rather than attacking Baldwin directly, he began a careful campaign to isolate the would-be rebel by strengthening his relationships with other powerful nobles who might otherwise remain neutral in any future conflict. His first move was to visit the castle of Walter Giffard, one of Normandy's most respected military commanders and a man whose loyalty to the ducal family was beyond question. Walter had served Duke Robert faithfully for decades, participating in campaigns that had expanded Norman territory and increased the duchy's wealth and prestige. His support would be crucial in any confrontation with Baldwin's faction. The conversation that took place in Walter's Great Hall that winter evening revealed William's growing mastery of the subtle art of medieval diplomacy. He did not directly accuse Baldwin of treachery, which might have forced Walter to choose sides prematurely. Instead, he spoke generally about the challenges facing young rulers and the importance of maintaining unity during periods of external threat. His words were carefully chosen to plant seeds of concern about Baldwin's activities without appearing to make specific accusations. Walter, a veteran of countless political intrigues, understood the implications immediately. His response was equally subtle, expressing confidence in William's abilities while noting the unfortunate tendency of some nobles to mistake youth for weakness. The conversation ended with Walter's pledge to remain vigilant against any threats to ducal authority, a commitment that William knew he could rely upon when the inevitable crisis arrived. Similar conversations took place throughout that winter, as William methodically built a coalition of supporters who would stand with him when Baldwin finally revealed his true intentions. Each meeting required careful calibration of message and approach, as different nobles responded to different types of persuasion. Some were motivated by personal loyalty to the ducal family, others by practical calculations about which side was likely to prevail in any conflict. The most challenging of these diplomatic missions involved Nigel de Cotentin, a powerful baron whose territories controlled key ports along Normandy's western coast. Nigel was known for his pragmatic approach to politics and his willingness to support whichever faction could best protect his commercial interests. His neutrality in any conflict would effectively determine its outcome, as his ports provided access to potential allies and mercenaries from across the English Channel. William's meeting with Nigel took place in the baron's private chambers, away from the prying eyes and ears of other courtiers. The conversation that followed was unlike any diplomatic exchange William had previously conducted, requiring him to demonstrate not just political acumen, but also detailed knowledge of trade routes, commercial law, and international relationships that affected Norman prosperity. Nigel tested the young duke's son with questions that revealed whether he truly understood the complex economic foundations of ducal power. How would William protect merchant vessels from pirates operating out of hostile ports? What policies would he implement to encourage foreign traders to use Norman markets? How would he balance the competing interests of different commercial guilds without triggering economic warfare between them? William's responses impressed even the cynical baron, demonstrating that his education had encompassed far more than military strategy and court politics. He spoke knowledgeably about currency exchange rates, harbour facilities, and the diplomatic agreements that facilitated international commerce. More importantly, he showed genuine understanding of how military and commercial interests intersected, and how successful rulers needed to master both domains to maintain their power. By spring, Baldwin's conspiracy had reached the point where open action became inevitable. Intelligence reports indicated that he was preparing to move against several key ducal strongholds, while simultaneously demanding that William submit to his guardianship for the good of the duchy. The carefully worded ultimatum that arrived at the ducal court in May left no room for negotiation or compromise. William's response to this ultimate challenge revealed how completely he had absorbed the lessons of his father's reign. Rather than reacting with the impulsive anger that might be expected from a teenager faced with such a threat, he methodically activated the coalition he had spent months building. Messages went out to loyal nobles throughout Normandy, calling them to honour their oaths and defend legitimate ducal authority against treasonous rebellion. The speed and efficiency of William's mobilisation caught Baldwin completely off guard. The older man had calculated that the young duke's inexperience would prevent effective resistance to his coup attempt. Instead, he found himself facing a coordinated response from forces that outnumbered his own supporters and enjoyed superior strategic positions throughout the duchy. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Baldwin's forces, discovering that they were isolated and outnumbered, began defecting to William's side before any major battle could take place. The would-be rebel, recognizing that his position had become untenable, attempted to flee to friendly territory beyond Normandy's borders. He was captured before reaching safety, bringing to an end the first serious challenge to William's inheritance. The trial and execution of Baldwin de Brion marked a turning point in William's development as a ruler. The young man who had once relied on his father's protection now demonstrated that he possessed the ruthless decisiveness necessary to maintain power in medieval society. But he also showed mercy to Baldwin's followers, who had been deceived into supporting the rebellion, understanding that excessive vengeance might create new enemies and undermine the stability he was trying to preserve. The successful suppression of Baldwin's revolt established William's reputation throughout Normandy and beyond as a leader who combined youthful energy with mature political judgment. Foreign courts that had been watching the duchy for signs of weakness now recognized that Robert's son possessed the qualities necessary to maintain Norman power and independence. This recognition would prove crucial as William began to contemplate more ambitious enterprises than merely defending his inherited territories. The summer following Baldwin's defeat brought news that would forever change the trajectory of William's life. Messengers arriving from the Holy Land carried word that Duke Robert had died of fever while returning from his pilgrimage, making 18-year-old William the undisputed ruler of Normandy. The transition from regent to duke required new ceremonies and fresh oaths of allegiance, but the political groundwork laid during the previous months ensured that these formalities proceeded smoothly. William's first actions as duke revealed the ambitious vision that would eventually lead him to attempt the conquest of England. Rather than simply maintaining the status quo inherited from his father, he began implementing reforms designed to strengthen ducal authority while expanding Norman influence beyond traditional boundaries. These changes reflected his understanding that survival in medieval politics required constant growth and adaptation. His administrative reforms focused on creating more efficient systems for collecting taxes and raising armies, recognizing that financial and military resources were the foundation of all political power. William established new procedures for assessing the wealth of noble estates, ensuring that ducal revenues reflected the actual prosperity of his territories, rather than outdated valuations that had not been updated for generations. The military reforms were equally significant, introducing training standards and equipment requirements that transformed Norman forces into the most professional army in Western Europe. William understood that future conflicts would require not just brave warriors, but disciplined soldiers capable of executing complex tactical maneuvers under battlefield conditions. His emphasis on combined arms tactics, integrating cavalry, infantry, and archers into coordinated formations, would later prove decisive in his conquest of England. But perhaps most importantly, William began cultivating relationships with foreign courts that would provide him with allies and intelligence when he eventually decided to pursue claims beyond Normandy's borders. His diplomatic initiatives reached from the papal court in Rome to the royal courts of France and England, creating networks of communication and influence that would serve him throughout his career. The English connection proved particularly significant as William learned more about the complex succession disputes surrounding King Edward the Confessor's throne. Edward's childless marriage and advanced age made it increasingly likely that multiple claimants would compete for the crown when he died. William's own tenuous claim, based on distant family relationships and alleged promises from Edward himself, would require careful preparation and skillful diplomacy to pursue successfully. Through merchants and pilgrims travelling between Normandy and England, William gathered detailed intelligence about English political factions, military capabilities, and potential sources of support for a Norman claimant. He learned about the growing tension between Earl Godwin's powerful family and King Edward's court, conflicts that might provide opportunities for foreign intervention when the succession crisis finally arrived. The religious dimension of William's preparations involved strengthening his relationship with reform movements within the church that viewed the English religious establishment as corrupt and in need of purification. His patronage of monasteries and support for scholarly activities created connections with influential clerics who might later provide theological justification for his conquest of England. As William entered his 20s, observers throughout Europe began recognizing that the young Duke of Normandy possessed qualities that marked him as a potential conqueror, rather than merely a capable administrator of inherited territories. His combination of military skill, political intelligence, and ruthless ambition suggested that he might attempt enterprises that would either establish him among history's greatest rulers or destroy everything his ancestors had built in Normandy. The stage was being set for conflicts that would reshape the political map of Western Europe, with William emerging as one of the central figures in dramas that would determine whether Norman culture would remain confined to its original boundaries or expand to transform entire kingdoms. The bastard child who had once faced constant challenges to his legitimacy was preparing to challenge the legitimacy of crowns that had been worn by established dynasties for centuries. The transformation of William from defensive regent to aggressive conqueror was gradual but unmistakable to those who observed his court during these crucial years. The young man who had once focused primarily on preserving his inherited position now spoke increasingly of opportunities that lay beyond traditional Norman boundaries. His conversations with advisors and allies began to include discussions of hypothetical campaigns and potential conquests that suggested his ambitions had grown far beyond anything his father had contemplated. These evolving ambitions would soon be tested by challenges that would determine whether William possessed not just the vision to conceive great enterprises, but the practical skills necessary to execute them successfully against determined opposition. The next phase of his remarkable journey would reveal whether the lessons learned during his youth had truly prepared him for the ultimate test of medieval leadership: the conquest and governance of a foreign kingdom whose people had no reason to welcome Norman rule. The years that followed would test every aspect of William's character as he faced challenges that would have broken lesser men. The daily rhythm of ducal life in the 1040s was relentless, demanding constant attention to matters both grand and mundane. William's typical day began in the grey hour before dawn, when the castle's bells called the faithful to morning prayers. In the cold stone chapel adjoining his private chambers, William would kneel on the worn flagstones, his breath visible in the chill air as he recited the prayers that connected him to the divine authority he believed sanctioned his rule. These moments of solitude were precious, representing the only time in his day when political calculations could be set aside in favour of spiritual contemplation. The young duke's faith was not merely ceremonial, but deeply personal, providing him with the inner certainty that would later enable him to risk everything on seemingly impossible ventures. After prayers came the first meal of the day, taken in his private chambers with only his most trusted advisors present. The conversation over bread and watered wine inevitably turned to the intelligence reports that had arrived during the night. William's network of spies and informants stretched throughout Normandy and beyond, providing him with detailed information about the movements and intentions of potential enemies. A typical morning briefing might include news of troop movements along the duchy's borders, reports of noble marriages that could shift political alliances, or intelligence about English court politics that might affect future succession disputes. William absorbed this information with the focused attention of a scholar studying sacred texts, understanding that survival depended upon staying ahead of his enemy's plans. The formal court session began at the 3rd hour after sunrise, when the great hall filled with petitioners seeking ducal justice or favour. William's throne, carved from a single piece of Norman oak, and elevated on a platform that reminded all present of the hierarchical nature of medieval society, served as the focal point for these proceedings. The young duke's bearing during these sessions was carefully calculated to project both accessibility and authority. Each case that came before him required not just legal judgment, but political analysis. A dispute between two minor barons over water rights might seem trivial, but William understood that such conflicts could escalate into broader rebellions if not handled with wisdom and fairness, and he listened to each argument with apparent patience, asking pointed questions that revealed the underlying motivations behind legal claims while demonstrating his mastery of Norman law and custom. The afternoon hours were devoted to military training and planning, activities that revealed William's true passion and natural genius. In the castle's practice yards, he worked with weapons masters who pushed him to perfect skills that were already superior to those of most seasoned knights. His sword work combined the brutal efficiency valued by Norman warriors with a tactical sophistication that reflected his analytical mind's application to combat techniques. But it was in strategic planning sessions that William's exceptional abilities became most apparent. Gathered around detailed maps spread across oak tables, he and his military advisors would debate hypothetical campaigns and analyze potential threats with an intensity that impressed veteran commanders. William's questions revealed not just theoretical knowledge, but practical understanding of the logistical challenges that determined whether military operations succeeded or failed. How many horses would be required to transport supplies for a 1,000-man army across hostile territory? What seasonal factors might affect the availability of forage for cavalry mounts? How could coastal fortifications be reduced without siege engines that would be difficult to transport by sea? These were the types of problems that occupied William's attention during long winter evenings, when other young nobles might have been content with entertainment and leisure. The social obligations of ducal life required William to maintain a court that reflected Norman culture's unique blend of warrior tradition and continental sophistication. Evening meals in the Great Hall were elaborate affairs that served multiple purposes beyond simple nourishment. The careful arrangement of seating reflected current political relationships, while the quality of food and wine demonstrated the duchy's prosperity to visiting dignitaries and potential allies. During these gatherings, William displayed the social skills that were as essential to medieval leadership as military prowess. He could engage learned clerics in theological discussions that revealed his education's depth, while simultaneously charming visiting merchants with detailed knowledge of trade routes and commercial opportunities. His ability to adapt his conversation to his audience's interests and concerns helped him build the broad coalition of supporters that would later prove essential to his success. The entertainment provided during these evening gatherings reflected Norman society's complex cultural identity. Singers might perform ancient Norse sagas that celebrated the warrior virtues of William's Viking ancestors, followed by more refined French poetry that demonstrated the duchy's adoption of continental literary traditions. William himself was known to participate in these performances, his powerful voice carrying traditional songs that connected him to the common soldiers who would follow him into battle. But beneath the surface of courtly refinement, the constant undercurrent of violence that characterized medieval life was never far from view. Disputes that began with words in the great hall might end with swords in the castle yard. William learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when seemingly friendly conversations were turning dangerous, developing the political instincts necessary to defuse potential conflicts before they could destabilize his court. The administrative demands of governing Normandy required William to master skills that were far removed from the romantic image of medieval knighthood. Long hours spent reviewing tax assessments and legal documents taught him the unglamorous realities of political power. He learned that maintaining an army capable of defending the duchy required not just brave warriors, but efficient systems for collecting the revenues that paid for weapons, armor, and supplies. His personal involvement in these administrative details set him apart from many contemporary rulers who preferred to delegate such mundane matters to subordinates. William understood that effective leadership required comprehensive knowledge of every aspect of governance, from the grand strategies that shaped foreign policy to the minute regulations that governed market activities in Norman towns. The correspondence that flowed to and from William's court provided him with a graduate education in international diplomacy. Letters from papal legates, royal courts, and fellow nobles throughout Europe required careful analysis to understand their writers' true intentions. The formal language of medieval diplomacy concealed as much as it revealed, requiring recipients to read between the lines to discern whether seemingly friendly communications contained hidden threats or unexpected opportunities. William's responses to this correspondence revealed his growing sophistication as a political strategist. His letters were masterpieces of diplomatic ambiguity, phrased in ways that could be interpreted differently depending upon future developments. A message that appeared to offer friendship and cooperation might contain subtle warnings about the consequences of hostile action, while maintaining enough ambiguity to preserve negotiating flexibility. The religious obligations of ducal life extended far beyond personal devotions to encompass William's role as patron and protector of Norman churches and monasteries. His regular visits to religious institutions throughout the duchy served multiple purposes, demonstrating his piety while providing opportunities to gather intelligence about local conditions and popular opinion. During these visits, William would typically attend elaborate religious ceremonies that reinforced the connection between spiritual and temporal authority. His prominent participation in these rituals sent clear messages about his commitment to Christian values, while his generous donations to religious institutions created networks of clerical supporters who would later provide crucial legitimacy for his more ambitious enterprises. The monks and priests who served these institutions were often among the most educated members of Norman society, possessing knowledge of foreign languages, classical literature, and contemporary political developments that made them valuable sources of information and advice. William cultivated relationships with these clerics carefully, understanding that their support could prove as valuable as military alliances in legitimizing controversial political actions. The seasonal cycle of medieval life imposed its own rhythm on William's activities and concerns. Spring brought preparation for military campaigns, as roads became passable and supplies could be transported more easily. Summer meant the active campaign season, when disputes that had simmered through the winter months might finally be resolved through armed conflict. Autumn was the time for harvest festivals and administrative accounting, when the year's revenues were calculated and plans made for the following year's expenditures. William's personal participation in these harvest celebrations demonstrated his connection to the agricultural foundation of Norman prosperity, while the detailed financial reviews revealed his mastery of the economic factors that determined military and political possibilities. Winter brought a different set of challenges and opportunities, as travel became more difficult and military activities were generally suspended until spring. These months were devoted to planning, diplomacy, and the complex negotiations that shaped political relationships throughout medieval Europe. William used this time to strengthen alliances, resolve internal disputes, and prepare for the challenges that each new year would inevitably bring. The intelligence networks that William developed during these years would prove crucial to his later success as a conqueror and ruler. His agents operated throughout Europe, gathering information about military capabilities, political developments, and potential opportunities that might be exploited by an ambitious Norman duke. These networks required constant attention and substantial financial investment, but they provided William with strategic advantages that his enemies often failed to recognize until too late. The reports that reached William's private chambers painted detailed pictures of foreign courts and their internal dynamics. He learned about personality conflicts between English nobles that might be exploited during a succession crisis, about French royal policies that could affect Norman interests, and about papal politics that might influence church support for future military enterprises. The personal relationships that William built during his daily interactions with nobles, clerics, merchants, and common soldiers created the foundation for the loyalty that would later enable him to undertake seemingly impossible ventures. His ability to remember names, family connections, and personal preferences impressed those who served him, while his reputation for keeping promises and rewarding faithful service encouraged others to risk their lives and fortunes in his service. These relationships were built through countless small interactions that revealed William's character more clearly than any grand gestures. His treatment of servants, his patience with tedious administrative details, and his willingness to share the hardships of military campaigns created bonds of personal loyalty that transcended the formal obligations of feudal service. As William entered his 25th year, the daily routines that had shaped his character for nearly a decade began to yield their intended results. The young duke who had once struggled to maintain authority over rebellious vassals was now recognized throughout Europe as one of the most capable rulers of his generation. His court attracted ambitious young nobles from across the continent, men who recognized that service to William offered opportunities for advancement that were unavailable elsewhere. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to those who observed William's development over time. The intense focus that had once been directed primarily toward survival was now channeled toward expansion and conquest. The defensive mindset of his youth was giving way to the aggressive confidence that would soon lead him to attempt enterprises that contemporaries would consider either brilliantly audacious or completely insane. The daily life that had once revolved around protecting inherited territories now increasingly focused on identifying opportunities to expand Norman influence beyond traditional boundaries. Military exercises that had once emphasized defensive tactics now explored offensive strategies suitable for campaigns in foreign territories. Diplomatic correspondence that had once sought primarily to maintain existing relationships now probed for weaknesses that might be exploited by an ambitious conqueror. The physical demands of ducal life had forged William's body into an instrument perfectly suited for the challenges of medieval warfare. Years of daily weapons training had given him strength and endurance that impressed even professional soldiers, while his participation in actual campaigns had provided the practical experience necessary to lead men effectively under battlefield conditions. His intellectual development had been equally impressive, transforming a naturally intelligent youth into a sophisticated strategist, capable of managing complex political and military operations simultaneously. The combination of theoretical knowledge gained through formal education and practical wisdom, acquired through direct experience, created a leader uniquely equipped to succeed in the chaotic environment of medieval politics. The economic foundation of Norman power had been systematically strengthened through William's administrative reforms and commercial policies. The duchy's revenues had grown substantially under his rule, providing the financial resources necessary to maintain larger armies and undertake more ambitious enterprises than previous generations of Norman rulers had attempted. The military capabilities at William's disposal reflected both the traditional strengths of Norman warfare and innovative adaptations that gave his forces advantages over conventional medieval armies. His emphasis on professional training, standardized equipment, and coordinated tactics created military units that could execute complex maneuvers under combat conditions, while maintaining the individual courage and skill that characterized Norman warriors. As 1050 approached, William's daily routine increasingly included discussions and preparations that suggested his ambitions had grown far beyond anything his predecessors had contemplated. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk now included detailed assessments of English military capabilities, analyses of potential landing sites along the English coast, and evaluations of political factions that might support or oppose a Norman invasion. The correspondence flowing from his court now reached contacts throughout Europe who might provide crucial support for unprecedented enterprises. Papal legates received carefully crafted arguments about the need for church reform in England, while potential allies were offered incentives that might secure their cooperation in hypothetical future campaigns. The transformation of William from cautious defender to ambitious conqueror was approaching completion, setting the stage for events that would reshape the political landscape of Western Europe. The daily routines that had once focused on survival and consolidation were now directed toward preparation for ventures that would either establish William among history's greatest conquerors or destroy everything he had worked to build in Normandy. The bastard child who had once faced constant challenges to his legitimacy was preparing to challenge the legitimacy of the English crown itself, confident that the lessons learned through years of careful preparation had equipped him with the knowledge and capabilities necessary to succeed where others had failed. The next phase of his remarkable journey would test whether this confidence was justified or whether it would lead to the destruction of everything he had accomplished during his extraordinary rise to power. The morning of October 14th, 1066, would dawn crisp and clear over the rolling hills of Sussex, but William could not have known as he went through his daily preparations in the autumn of 1051 that this date would forever mark the culmination of everything he was building toward. The intelligence reaching his private chambers that year painted an increasingly detailed picture of opportunities that lay across the English Channel. Opportunities that would require every skill he had developed and every alliance he had forged. The English court of King Edward the Confessor was fracturing along predictable lines, with Earl Godwin of Wessex and his ambitious sons positioning themselves as the dominant force in English politics. William's spies reported that tensions between the Godwin family and the king had reached dangerous levels, creating instabilities that a skilled foreign observer might eventually exploit. More intriguingly, these same reports suggested that King Edward, perhaps seeking to balance Godwin's growing power, had been making overtures to Norman nobles about potential future arrangements. In his private study, surrounded by maps and correspondence that few were permitted to see, William began the careful analysis that would eventually lead to his most audacious gamble. The reports from England revealed a kingdom that possessed vast wealth and strategic importance, but whose political structure contained weaknesses that might be vulnerable to the right kind of pressure applied at the right moment. The English military system, while capable of producing brave individual warriors, lacked the professional discipline and tactical coordination that characterized Norman forces. English armies relied heavily on the Fyrd, a militia system that could provide large numbers of fighting men, but struggled to maintain extended campaigns or execute complex battlefield maneuvers. Their noble cavalry, while personally courageous, had not developed the coordinated charge tactics that made Norman knights virtually unstoppable on suitable terrain. More significantly, the English succession system contained ambiguities that could potentially legitimize foreign claims under the right circumstances. Unlike the clear primogeniture that governed Norman inheritance, English royal succession involved complex negotiations between the king, the Witan assembly of nobles, and various claimants whose rights derived from different sources and traditions. A sufficiently strong claimant, with appropriate legal justification, might find English nobles willing to accept foreign rule, rather than face civil war. William's morning routine now included regular conferences with a small group of advisors who possessed specialized knowledge relevant to potential English ventures. Ralph de Tosney, whose family had extensive connections across the Channel, provided detailed intelligence about English noble families and their internal relationships. William Fitz-Osbern, one of the Duke's oldest friends and most trusted lieutenants, contributed military expertise about the logistical challenges of conducting campaigns in foreign territory. These discussions revealed the extraordinary complexity of any attempt to claim the English throne by force. The English Channel itself presented formidable obstacles, requiring specialized ships and favorable weather conditions that might be available only during brief seasonal windows. Even if a Norman army could successfully cross the water, establishing secure bases of operation on hostile territory would require careful coordination between military and political initiatives. The financial requirements for such an enterprise staggered even William's imagination. Building the ships necessary to transport thousands of men and their equipment would consume vast resources, while maintaining armies in foreign territory would require supply lines that could easily be disrupted by English defenders. The economic calculations suggested that success would depend not just on military victory, but on rapid political consolidation that could transform conquest costs into administrative revenues. Yet despite these daunting challenges, William's analysis also revealed opportunities that made the enterprise seem feasible rather than merely fantastical. The Norman military system had evolved specifically to excel at the type of rapid, decisive campaigns that would be necessary for successful invasion. Norman tactics emphasized speed, coordination, and adaptability rather than the static defensive strategies that characterized much medieval warfare. The political fragmentation of English noble society created potential allies for any claimant who could offer attractive terms to ambitious families seeking advancement. William's intelligence suggested that several powerful English nobles harbored grievances against the current system that might make them receptive to overtures from a strong foreign candidate. who promised to reward their support generously. Most importantly, the religious dimension of any potential claim offered possibilities for legitimacy that could transform naked aggression into righteous conquest. The English Church, while deeply rooted in local traditions, maintained connections to continental reform movements that viewed certain aspects of English religious practice as corrupt or inadequate. A Norman claimant who presented his invasion as a mission to purify English Christianity might gain papal support that would provide international legitimacy for his enterprise. During the winter months of 1051 and 1052, William's correspondence revealed his growing seriousness about English possibilities. Letters to potential allies began exploring hypothetical scenarios that would require their support, while communications with religious authorities laid groundwork for theological arguments that might justify future actions. These diplomatic preparations were conducted with characteristic subtlety, maintaining enough ambiguity to preserve flexibility while establishing the relationships that would be crucial when decisive action became necessary. The daily routine of weapons practice took on new urgency as William began preparing his body for challenges that would exceed anything he had previously faced. The sword work that had once focused primarily on individual combat skills now emphasized the type of coordinated fighting that would be necessary for leading cavalry charges against disciplined enemy formations. His training partners, selected from among Normandy's most skilled knights, pushed him to master techniques that combined personal prowess with tactical awareness. The castle's practice yards echoed with the sounds of intensive preparation as William and his closest followers rehearsed maneuvers that would be essential for success in English campaigns. Mock battles involving hundreds of participants tested strategies for coordinating different types of troops under battlefield conditions, while smaller exercises refined the communication systems that would enable complex tactical adjustments during actual combat. The administrative aspects of William's daily routine expanded to encompass planning requirements that dwarfed anything previous Norman rulers had attempted. The logistics of assembling, transporting, and sustaining invasion forces required detailed knowledge of shipping capabilities, supply sources, and financial resources that pushed Norman governmental systems to their limits. William personally reviewed calculations about horse transport, weapon production, and food preservation that would determine whether ambitious plans could be translated into practical reality. His evening conferences increasingly resembled military staff meetings rather than traditional court gatherings, with detailed discussions of technical problems that had no precedent in Norman experience. How could cavalry horses be transported across rough seas without losing their effectiveness for battle? What types of fortifications could be constructed quickly using materials available in English territory? How could communication be maintained between invasion forces and Norman strongholds during extended campaigns? The intelligence networks that William had developed throughout his rule now focused intensively on English targets, providing increasingly detailed information about potential invasion routes, defensive preparations, and political developments that might affect timing considerations. His agents operating in England sent regular reports about the movements of key nobles, the condition of coastal defences, and the popular mood regarding King Edward's policies. These intelligence reports painted a picture of an English kingdom that was both formidable and vulnerable, possessing substantial resources and military capabilities, but struggling with internal divisions that might be exploited by a sufficiently skillful aggressor. The challenge for William was determining when these vulnerabilities might create opportunities that justified the enormous risks involved in attempting conquest. The religious obligations that had always been central to William's daily routine now acquired additional significance as he contemplated enterprises that would require divine approval for success. His personal devotions included increasingly specific prayers for guidance about future decisions, while his patronage of religious institutions focused on projects that might generate spiritual benefits applicable to military campaigns. The monastery at Bec, under the direction of Abbot Lanfranc, became particularly important to William's spiritual preparation as he sought theological justification for potential actions against England. The learned monks provided sophisticated arguments about the circumstances under which warfare could be considered just and righteous, helping William develop the intellectual framework that would later support his claim to be acting as God's instrument in purifying English Christianity. During the spring of 1052, events in England began moving in directions that seemed to validate William's careful preparations. The confrontation between King Edward and Earl Godwin escalated into open conflict that temporarily drove the powerful Earl and his family into exile. This development created unprecedented opportunities for foreign intervention, as Edward sought allies who might help him balance the political forces that had dominated English politics for decades. William's response to these developments revealed the sophisticated strategic thinking that would characterize his approach to the English venture. Rather than immediately seizing the obvious opportunity presented by Godwin's exile, he carefully analyzed the long-term implications of different possible interventions. His intelligence suggested that Godwin's exile might be temporary, and that premature involvement in English politics could create enemies without achieving lasting advantages. Instead, William focused on strengthening his relationships with King Edward while avoiding commitments that might limit his future options. His diplomatic communications with the English court expressed sympathy for Edward's difficulties, while offering general support that stopped short of specific military assistance. This approach maintained valuable connections while preserving the flexibility that would be essential when more decisive opportunities emerged. The summer campaigning season of 1052 provided William with opportunities to test military innovations that might prove valuable in future English campaigns. His forces conducted exercises that emphasized rapid deployment and coordinated attacks against fortified positions, scenarios that reflected the challenges likely to be encountered during invasion operations. These training programs revealed both capabilities and limitations that would influence strategic planning for actual campaigns. The return of Earl Godwin to England in the autumn of 1052, accomplished through a combination of popular support and political maneuvering that forced King Edward to accept his restoration, demonstrated the complexity of English politics in ways that both encouraged and concerned William's ambitions. Godwin's success showed that determined leaders could overcome seemingly impossible odds through skillful exploitation of popular sentiment and noble rivalries. But it also revealed the resilience of established English political networks that might resist foreign intervention more effectively than William had initially calculated. The winter months following Godwin's return were devoted to reassessing English possibilities in light of these new developments. William's analysis suggested that direct confrontation with the restored Godwin family would be extremely difficult, but that future succession crises might create opportunities for more subtle interventions. The key was maintaining readiness to act decisively when circumstances became favorable, while avoiding premature commitments that might waste resources or create unnecessary enemies. The daily rhythm of ducal life during 1053 reflected this strategic patience, with continued military preparation balanced against diplomatic initiatives designed to preserve future options. William's correspondence with English nobles increased in frequency and sophistication, establishing relationships that might prove valuable during future crises, while gathering intelligence about potential supporters and opponents of Norman intervention. The most significant development of this period was William's growing conviction that successful conquest of England would require not just military victory, but comprehensive political and religious transformation that could legitimize Norman rule in the eyes of the conquered population. This recognition led to expanded planning that encompassed governmental structures, legal systems, and cultural policies that would be necessary for converting military success into lasting political control. His study of Roman conquest histories provided models for the type of systematic transformation that would be required, while his analysis of more recent Frankish and German expansions revealed both successful strategies and dangerous pitfalls that contemporary conquerors had encountered. These historical studies influenced his approach to current preparations, emphasizing the importance of planning for governance, rather than focusing exclusively on military operations. The administrative burden of these expanded preparations required William to develop new systems for managing information and coordinating complex projects that involved military, diplomatic, financial, and religious components simultaneously. His personal staff grew to include specialists in areas ranging from naval construction to canon law, creating an informal planning organization that resembled a modern military staff more than a traditional medieval court. The physical demands of this intensified preparation routine pushed William's endurance to its limits, requiring him to maintain peak military readiness while simultaneously mastering the detailed knowledge necessary for effective strategic planning. His daily schedule expanded to include technical consultations that might last for hours, followed by physical training that maintained the combat skills essential for personal leadership during actual campaigns. The social obligations of ducal life became increasingly focused on building the coalition of supporters that would be essential for any major enterprise. William's court attracted ambitious young nobles from throughout Europe who recognized that service to the Norman Duke offered opportunities for advancement that were unavailable elsewhere. These relationships, built through shared hardships and mutual respect, created bonds of personal loyalty that would prove crucial during the challenges ahead. The evening gatherings in William's Great Hall increasingly resembled planning sessions rather than traditional entertainment, with discussions of hypothetical scenarios that tested different approaches to complex strategic problems. The Norman nobles who participated in these conversations developed sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in foreign conquest, while their commitment to William's leadership deepened through their involvement in planning processes that made them stakeholders in potential success. As 1054 began, William's daily routine had evolved to encompass preparation activities that would have been unthinkable during his youth. The defensive mindset that had once characterized his approach to leadership had been completely replaced by aggressive confidence in his ability to undertake enterprises that would either establish him among history's greatest conquerors or destroy everything he had built in Normandy. The transformation was evident in every aspect of his behavior, from the tactical exercises that now emphasized offensive operations in foreign territory to the diplomatic initiatives that probed for opportunities to exploit weaknesses in neighboring kingdoms. The young man who had once struggled to maintain authority over rebellious vassals was now planning campaigns that would challenge the established order throughout Western Europe. The intelligence reaching his chambers painted increasingly detailed pictures of opportunities that lay beyond Norman borders, while the military capabilities at his disposal had grown to levels that made previously impossible ventures seem achievable through careful planning and determined execution. The financial resources generated through his administrative reforms provided the foundation for enterprises that would require unprecedented investments in men, equipment, and supplies. Most importantly, the personal relationships and institutional structures that William had built during his years as Duke created the political foundation necessary for sustained campaigns in foreign territory. The loyalty of his followers, earned through years of shared challenges and mutual success, provided the human resources that would be essential for any attempt to conquer and hold distant territories against determined resistance. The daily preparations that had once focused on survival and consolidation were now directed toward ventures that would test every skill William had developed and every alliance he had forged. The bastard child who had once faced constant challenges to his legitimacy was preparing to challenge the legitimacy of ancient royal dynasties, confident that his careful preparation had equipped him with the capabilities necessary to succeed where others had failed throughout history. The year 1054 brought with it a series of events that would test William's evolving strategic vision in ways he could never have anticipated. As winter gave way to spring, disturbing reports began reaching his private chambers about developments that threatened to upset the delicate balance of power he had worked so carefully to establish throughout Northern Europe. The death of Earl Godwin in April of that year created a vacuum in English politics that his son Harold moved quickly to fill. But Harold Godwinson was a different type of adversary than his father had been. Where Godwin had been a master of political intrigue who preferred negotiation to warfare, Harold possessed both the cunning of a seasoned politician and the martial skills of a professional warrior. William's intelligence networks painted a picture of a man who combined dangerous ambition with the practical capabilities necessary to achieve his goals. Harold's consolidation of power in England proceeded with efficiency that impressed even William's most experienced advisors. The new Earl of Wessex demonstrated an understanding of English political dynamics that enabled him to build coalitions while simultaneously eliminating potential rivals. His treatment of the English nobility revealed sophisticated judgment about when to offer incentives and when to apply pressure, creating a power base that appeared far more stable than anything his father had achieved. More troubling still were reports suggesting that Harold had begun implementing military reforms that addressed many of the weaknesses William had identified in English defensive capabilities. The traditional fired system was being supplemented with professional troops trained in continental fighting techniques, while coastal fortifications were being strengthened in ways that would complicate any future invasion attempts. William's morning briefings during this period took on an urgency that reflected his growing recognition that the window of opportunity for English intervention might be closing more rapidly than he had anticipated. The daily intelligence reports revealed a kingdom that was becoming more unified under Harold's leadership, while simultaneously developing military capabilities that could neutralize many of the advantages Norman forces had previously enjoyed. Yet even as these developments complicated his strategic calculations, William began receiving information that suggested new opportunities were emerging from unexpected directions. The papal court in Rome was becoming increasingly concerned about what it viewed as irregularities in English church practices, creating possibilities for religious justification that could legitimize Norman intervention as a mission of spiritual reform rather than mere conquest. The relationship between Rome and the English Church had been deteriorating for several years over questions of canonical authority and theological doctrine. English bishops, long accustomed to operating with considerable independence from papal oversight, were resisting continental reform movements that sought to standardize religious practices throughout Western Christianity. This resistance provided William with opportunities to present himself as a champion of Orthodox Christianity, fighting against English deviation from proper religious observance. Through carefully cultivated relationships with influential clerics, William began laying the groundwork for arguments that would portray any future campaign against England as a holy war sanctioned by divine authority. His correspondence with papal legates emphasized his commitment to church reform, while subtly highlighting the alleged shortcomings of English religious leadership. These diplomatic initiatives required delicate handling, as overly aggressive criticism of English Christianity might provoke defensive reactions that could strengthen rather than weaken Harold's position. The summer of 1054 brought military exercises that tested Norman capabilities against scenarios specifically designed to replicate the challenges of English campaigns. The coastal plains near Dives became the site of elaborate war games involving thousands of participants, with mock battles that explored different approaches to amphibious operations and rapid territorial consolidation. These exercises revealed both impressive capabilities and concerning limitations in Norman military preparations. The coordination between cavalry, infantry, and archers had reached levels of sophistication that surpassed anything achieved by previous medieval armies, while the logistical systems necessary for sustained foreign campaigns had been refined through careful study of classical and contemporary models. However, the challenges of maintaining supply lines across hostile territory remained formidable, particularly given the distances involved and the likelihood of organized English resistance. William's personal participation in these exercises demonstrated the physical conditioning that years of intensive training had produced. At 26, he possessed the strength and endurance necessary for the grueling demands of extended military campaigns, while his tactical judgment had matured to levels that impressed veteran commanders who had served his father. His ability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, combined with his talent for inspiring confidence in subordinates during moments of crisis, marked him as a natural military leader, whose capabilities extended far beyond mere personal prowess. The autumn months were devoted to diplomatic initiatives that probed for potential allies who might support Norman ventures in exchange for appropriate rewards. William's correspondence during this period reached courts throughout Europe, offering various forms of cooperation to rulers who possessed resources or strategic positions that could prove valuable during future campaigns. The most promising of these diplomatic overtures involved negotiations with Flemish nobles, whose territories controlled crucial ports and shipping resources. Count Baldwin V of Flanders, whose domains included some of Europe's most prosperous commercial centres, possessed both the wealth and maritime capabilities that would be essential for any major amphibious operation. His support could provide not just material resources, but also political legitimacy that would encourage other rulers to view Norman ventures favourably. These negotiations required William to balance competing considerations that tested his diplomatic skills to their limits. Count Baldwin demanded substantial concessions in exchange for his support, including territorial guarantees and commercial privileges that would significantly constrain Norman freedom of action. Yet without Flemish assistance, the logistical challenges of English invasion might prove insurmountable, regardless of Norman military capabilities. The winter planning sessions of 1054 and 1055 took place in an atmosphere of intense secrecy that reflected the sensitive nature of the discussions. William's closest advisors gathered in his private chambers for conferences that sometimes lasted through the night, examining every aspect of potential English campaigns with methodical thoroughness. These sessions revealed the extraordinary complexity of the enterprise William was contemplating, as military, political, financial, and religious considerations interacted in ways that created cascading effects throughout the entire strategic framework. The financial calculations alone were staggering in their implications. Building the fleet necessary for transporting invasion forces would require resources equivalent to several years of normal ducal revenues, while maintaining armies in foreign territory would consume additional wealth at rates that could bankrupt even prosperous domains. The economic analysis suggested that success would depend upon achieving rapid victory, followed by immediate exploitation of English resources to offset campaign costs. Yet, the potential rewards justified these enormous risks in ways that made the venture appear not just feasible, but almost inevitable. England's wealth, accumulated through centuries of successful agriculture and expanding commerce, offered prizes that could transform Normandy from a modest duchy into one of Europe's great powers. Control of English resources would provide the foundation for further expansion, creating possibilities for Norman influence that extended far beyond anything previous generations had imagined. The intelligence networks that supported these planning efforts had expanded to encompass sources throughout the known world, providing William with information that enabled strategic calculations of unprecedented sophistication. His agents operated not just in England and France, but in the Italian peninsula, the German territories, and even the distant courts of Eastern Europe, where political developments might eventually affect Western European balance of power. These intelligence operations required substantial financial investment and careful management to maintain the operational security that kept William's intentions hidden from potential enemies. The information they provided revealed opportunities and threats that influenced every aspect of strategic planning, from the timing of potential operations to the selection of allies who might provide crucial support during decisive moments. The daily routine of ducal administration during this period reflected the dual nature of William's position as both a responsible ruler of existing territories and an ambitious conqueror preparing for unprecedented ventures. Morning sessions devoted to traditional governmental business were followed by afternoon conferences that explored revolutionary possibilities, creating schedules that would have exhausted less determined leaders. His personal regimen during these months combined the physical training necessary for military leadership with the intellectual preparation required for complex political operations. Dawn exercises with weapons masters maintained the combat skills that would be essential for personal survival during actual campaigns, while evening studies with learned advisors developed the strategic understanding necessary for managing large-scale military and political enterprises. The social dimensions of court life became increasingly focused on building the personal relationships that would be crucial for maintaining loyalty during extended foreign campaigns. William's interactions with his followers revealed the charismatic leadership qualities that enabled him to inspire extraordinary devotion among men who understood they were being asked to risk everything for uncertain rewards. These relationships were forged through shared hardships that tested character under conditions similar to those that would be encountered during actual warfare. Hunting expeditions that lasted for weeks in harsh weather, military exercises that pushed participants to their physical limits, and diplomatic missions that required courage and discretion, all served as proving grounds for the loyalty that would be essential when decisive action became necessary. The spring of 1055 brought developments that seemed to validate William's patient preparation while simultaneously creating new urgencies that demanded immediate attention. Reports from England indicated that King Edward's health was declining in ways that made succession questions increasingly pressing, while Harold Godwinson's growing influence suggested that any delay in Norman intervention might allow him to consolidate power beyond the point where foreign challenges could succeed. The papal response to William's diplomatic overtures had been cautiously encouraging, with indications that church authorities might be prepared to support Norman intervention if it were presented as a mission to reform English religious practices. This potential source of legitimacy could transform what might otherwise appear as unprovoked aggression into a righteous crusade blessed by divine authority. Yet, the military intelligence reaching William's chambers painted a picture of English preparations that suggested Harold was anticipating external threats and taking measures to counter them. Coastal defences were being strengthened, military units were being expanded and retrained, and diplomatic initiatives were being launched to secure potential allies who might assist English resistance to foreign invasion. The strategic situation was evolving rapidly in directions that created both opportunities and dangers for Norman ambitions. The window of time during which English vulnerabilities might be exploited was narrowing, while the capabilities necessary for successful intervention were still being developed. William faced the classic dilemma of military planning, whether to act before preparations were complete and risk failure through inadequate resources, or to delay action while seeking perfection and risk losing the opportunity entirely. His decision-making process during this crucial period revealed the mature strategic judgment that distinguished him from less capable contemporary rulers. Rather than rushing precipitously toward premature action or allowing excessive caution to paralyze initiative, William sought to optimize the timing of intervention to maximize advantages while minimizing risks. The solution he developed involved accelerating certain aspects of preparation while deliberately delaying others to achieve the optimal combination of readiness and opportunity. Military preparations were intensified to ensure that Norman forces would be capable of rapid, decisive action when the moment arrived, while diplomatic initiatives were expanded to secure the political support that would be necessary for legitimizing intervention. The summer campaigns of 1055 provided crucial testing opportunities for the military innovations William had been developing throughout his preparation period. His forces conducted operations against rebellious barons in southern Normandy, using tactics specifically designed to replicate the conditions likely to be encountered during English campaigns. These actions served the dual purpose of maintaining internal security while providing realistic training for future foreign ventures. The performance of Norman forces during these operations exceeded even William's optimistic expectations, demonstrating levels of coordination and effectiveness that suggested his military reforms had produced capabilities superior to anything available to potential enemies. The speed with which fortified positions were reduced, the efficiency of logistical operations under field conditions, and the discipline maintained by troops during extended operations all indicated that Norman armies possessed the professional competence necessary for successful foreign conquest. More importantly, these campaigns revealed William's own evolution as a military commander, whose capabilities had transcended the tactical level to encompass the strategic vision necessary for managing complex operations involving multiple objectives and diverse forces. His ability to coordinate military action with political initiatives, to adapt plans in response to changing circumstances, and to maintain the confidence of subordinates during periods of uncertainty, marked him as a leader capable of succeeding at enterprises that would challenge the greatest commanders in history. The autumn of 1055 brought intelligence reports that suggested the moment for decisive action was approaching more rapidly than even William's most optimistic projections had anticipated. King Edward's deteriorating health created succession pressures that might soon force resolution of questions that had been simmering beneath the surface of English politics for years. Harold Godwinson's position as the most likely successor was strengthening, but his authority remained vulnerable to challenges that combined military capability with superior legal claims. The papal court had responded favourably to William's latest diplomatic overtures, indicating that church support for Norman intervention was moving from possibility toward probability. The theological arguments that presented English conquest as religious reform were gaining acceptance among influential clerics who possessed the authority to provide official sanction for military action. Most significantly, the intelligence networks that had been monitoring English political developments reported increasing instability within Harold's coalition that suggested his apparent strength might be more fragile than surface appearances indicated. Ambitious nobles who had accepted his leadership during the consolidation period following his father's death were beginning to question whether their interests were being adequately served by his policies. William's response to these developments revealed the strategic patience that had characterized his approach throughout the preparation period. Rather than immediately seizing what appeared to be emerging opportunities, he carefully analyzed the long-term implications of different possible interventions to ensure that any action taken would produce lasting advantages rather than temporary gains. The winter planning sessions of 1055 and 1056 reflected this analytical approach, as William and his advisors examined potential scenarios with systematic thoroughness that left no significant variable unconsidered. The discussions that took place during these conferences represented the culmination of years of preparation, bringing together military expertise, political intelligence, diplomatic knowledge, and strategic vision in ways that created comprehensive understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The plans that emerged from these sessions were remarkable for their scope and sophistication, addressing not just the immediate military requirements for successful invasion, but also the long-term administrative structures that would be necessary for governing conquered territories. William understood that military victory would be meaningless without the political and institutional framework necessary to convert conquest into lasting rule. His vision for post-conquest England reflected lessons learned from studying successful examples of foreign domination throughout history, combined with innovations that addressed the specific characteristics of English society and Norman capabilities. The governmental structures he envisioned would preserve enough English traditions to minimize resistance while implementing sufficient Norman practices to ensure effective control. The legal frameworks that would govern the conquered kingdom represented particularly sophisticated attempts to balance competing requirements for legitimacy and authority. English law would be preserved where it served Norman interests, while being modified or replaced where it conflicted with ducal prerogatives. The result would be a hybrid system that drew upon the best features of both traditions, while avoiding the weaknesses that had enabled previous conquests to fail. The economic policies planned for post-conquest administration reflected William's understanding that successful rule required not just political control, but also the prosperity that would make Norman governance preferable to alternatives that might be offered by potential rebels. English commercial activities would be encouraged and protected while being channeled in directions that served Norman strategic interests. The religious dimension of planned reforms offered perhaps the greatest opportunities for legitimizing Norman rule in ways that would be acceptable to the conquered population. The purification of English church practices, presented as a return to proper Christian observance, could provide theological justification that would make resistance appear not just futile, but actually sinful. As spring arrived in 1056, William's daily routine reflected the approaching culmination of nearly a decade of systematic preparation. The administrative responsibilities that had once consumed most of his attention were now handled efficiently by subordinates who had been trained to manage routine affairs independently, freeing the Duke to focus on the strategic decisions that would determine the success or failure of his most ambitious enterprise. The physical conditioning that had been maintained throughout the preparation period was intensified to ensure peak performance during the demanding campaigns that lay ahead. William's weapons training now emphasized not just individual combat skills, but also the leadership techniques that would be necessary for inspiring confidence during the chaos of actual battle. The diplomatic correspondence that flowed from his chambers revealed the final stages of coalition building, as potential allies were asked to make definitive commitments that would transform hypothetical support into concrete assistance. The responses to these overtures would determine whether Norman forces would face English resistance alone, or as part of a broader alliance that could provide crucial advantages during decisive moments. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk painted increasingly detailed pictures of English vulnerabilities and preparations, providing the information necessary for final tactical planning, while revealing the narrow window of opportunity that would soon either open or close forever. Harold's consolidation of power was proceeding steadily, but had not yet reached the point where foreign intervention would become impossible. King Edward's declining health created a sense of approaching crisis that affected calculations throughout European courts, as rulers recognized that English succession disputes might create opportunities for advancing their own interests through careful intervention. The diplomatic balance that had maintained relative stability for years was beginning to shift in ways that could either facilitate or complicate Norman ambitions. The papal response to William's latest theological arguments had reached the point where official sanction for military action seemed not just possible, but increasingly probable. The religious justification that would legitimize conquest in the eyes of Christian Europe was falling into place with timing that seemed to confirm divine approval for Norman enterprise. Most significantly, the military capabilities that had been developed through years of intensive preparation had reached levels that made previously impossible ventures appear achievable through careful execution. The Norman forces at William's disposal possessed advantages in training, equipment, coordination, and leadership that could offset the numerical superiority that English defenders would inevitably enjoy on their home territory. The convergence of these favorable factors created a strategic situation that validated William's patient approach to preparation, while simultaneously creating pressures for decisive action that could not be delayed much longer. The moment toward which everything had been building was approaching with inexorable momentum that would soon require him to commit everything he had built to the ultimate test of his vision and capabilities. The bastard child who had once struggled to maintain authority over rebellious Norman vassals was preparing to challenge the most established monarchy in Western Europe. Confident that his systematic preparation had created the conditions necessary for success where others throughout history had failed. The daily routines that had once focused on survival and consolidation were about to be tested in ways that would either establish William among the greatest conquerors in human history or destroy everything he had worked to achieve during his remarkable rise to power. The spring of 1056 would prove to be the final season of preparation before events began moving with a momentum that would carry William inexorably toward his destiny as either the conqueror of England or the architect of Norman destruction. Every skill he had developed, every alliance he had forged, and every strategic advantage he had gained would soon be tested in ways that would determine not just his personal fate, but the future course of European civilization itself. The intelligence that reached William's chambers on that pivotal morning in late May carried news that would transform speculation into urgent necessity. King Edward the Confessor had fallen gravely ill during the Easter celebrations at Winchester, and English nobles were already positioning themselves for the succession crisis that seemed inevitable. Harold Godwinson had moved swiftly to consolidate his influence over the royal household, while other claimants began marshalling their resources for what promised to be a decisive struggle for the English crown. William's response to this development revealed the mature strategic judgment that had been developing throughout his years of preparation. Rather than rushing immediately toward military action, he convened emergency sessions with his most trusted advisors to analyze the implications of Edward's illness for Norman interests. The discussions that took place over the following days would determine whether years of careful preparation would culminate in decisive action or prudent restraint. The morning briefings during this crucial period painted a complex picture of opportunities and dangers that required sophisticated analysis to navigate successfully. Harold's rapid consolidation of power suggested that delay might allow him to strengthen his position beyond the point where foreign intervention could succeed. Yet premature action without adequate preparation could result in catastrophic failure that would destroy everything William had built in Normandy. His daily routine during these tense weeks reflected the dual nature of his position as both a responsible ruler managing current affairs and an ambitious conqueror preparing for unprecedented ventures. Dawn conferences with military commanders explored the readiness of Norman forces for immediate deployment, while afternoon sessions with diplomatic advisors examined the international implications of different possible responses to English developments. The physical demands of maintaining peak military condition became even more intense as William recognized that personal leadership during actual combat might soon be required. His morning weapons training now included scenarios specifically designed to prepare him for the type of mounted combat that would be essential during English campaigns, while his strategic studies focused on the tactical challenges of coordinating complex operations in unfamiliar territory. The correspondence flowing from his chambers during this period revealed the final stages of diplomatic preparation as potential allies were asked to make definitive commitments that would transform theoretical support into practical assistance. The responses to these overtures arrived with increasing frequency, painting a picture of European opinion that was cautiously favorable to Norman ambitions while remaining concerned about the risks involved in challenging established English power. Count Baldwin of Flanders proved particularly receptive to William's proposals, recognizing that Norman success in England would create opportunities for Flemish commercial expansion, while simultaneously weakening potential rivals who might threaten his own territories. The negotiations that followed were complex and demanding, requiring William to balance Flemish demands for substantial concessions against his need to preserve freedom of action during future campaigns. The papal response to William's theological arguments reached a crucial turning point during this period, as church authorities began moving from cautious interest toward active support for Norman intervention. The religious justification that would legitimize conquest in the eyes of Christian Europe was falling into place with timing that seemed almost providential, providing William with moral authority that would prove as valuable as military capabilities. Through carefully cultivated relationships with influential clerics, William had successfully presented his potential campaign as a mission to reform corrupt English religious practices, rather than mere territorial aggrandizement. This theological framework would prove crucial for maintaining the loyalty of Norman forces during difficult moments while simultaneously undermining English resistance by questioning the legitimacy of their religious and political leadership. The summer of 1056 brought military exercises that tested Norman readiness under conditions designed to replicate the challenges of English campaigns as closely as possible. The coastal plains near Caen became the site of elaborate war games, involving thousands of participants, with scenarios that explored every aspect of amphibious operations, from initial landings through territorial consolidation. These exercises revealed both impressive capabilities and remaining limitations that influenced final preparations for actual operations. The coordination between different types of forces had reached levels of sophistication that surpassed anything achieved by contemporary armies, while the logistical systems necessary for sustained foreign campaigns had been refined through careful study of successful historical examples. William's personal performance during these exercises demonstrated the physical conditioning and tactical expertise that years of intensive training had produced. His ability to maintain effective command during chaotic situations, combined with his talent for inspiring confidence in subordinates under pressure, marked him as a military leader whose capabilities had transcended mere personal prowess to encompass the strategic vision necessary for managing complex operations. The autumn months were devoted to final diplomatic initiatives that would determine whether Norman forces would face English resistance alone or as part of a broader coalition that could provide crucial advantages during decisive moments. The negotiations that took place during this period were among the most challenging of William's career, requiring him to balance competing demands from potential allies while preserving the flexibility necessary for independent action. The intelligence networks that had been monitoring English developments throughout the preparation period now provided increasingly urgent reports about Harold's consolidation efforts and the growing probability that King Edward's death would trigger immediate succession disputes. The window of opportunity for Norman intervention was narrowing rapidly, creating pressures for decisive action that could not be delayed much longer. Yet even as these external pressures mounted, William maintained the analytical approach that had characterized his preparation throughout the previous years. His daily planning sessions examined every aspect of potential operations with methodical thoroughness, ensuring that when action finally became necessary, Norman forces would be as prepared as human effort could make them. The winter planning conferences of 1056 and 1057 represented the culmination of nearly a decade of systematic preparation, as William and his closest advisors finalized the strategic framework that would guide their most ambitious enterprise. The discussions that took place during these sessions addressed not just immediate military requirements, but also the long-term administrative structures that would be necessary for governing conquered territories. The plans that emerged from these conferences were remarkable for their comprehensive scope, addressing every conceivable challenge from initial invasion through permanent consolidation of Norman rule. Military operations were coordinated with political initiatives designed to minimize English resistance, while administrative preparations ensured that governmental functions could continue without interruption during the transition from conquest to stable governance. The legal frameworks that would govern post-conquest England reflected sophisticated understanding of both Norman and English traditions, creating hybrid systems that preserved popular customs while implementing ducal authority. The economic policies planned for the conquered kingdom emphasized continuity and prosperity rather than exploitation, recognizing that successful rule required the voluntary cooperation of the governed population. The spring of 1057 brought news that transformed careful preparation into urgent necessity. King Edward the Confessor's health had deteriorated beyond recovery, and his death was expected within months rather than years. Harold Godwinson had effectively assumed control of English governmental functions, while potential rivals prepared for succession struggles that would determine the kingdom's future. William's response to these developments revealed the mature judgment that had been developing throughout his preparation period. Rather than allowing external events to dictate his timing, he carefully analyzed the strategic situation to determine the optimal moment for intervention that would maximize advantages while minimizing risks. The daily routine that had sustained him throughout the preparation years now accelerated to accommodate the final phase of planning that would determine success or failure. Morning conferences with military commanders finalized operational details that had been developing for months, while afternoon sessions with diplomatic advisors coordinated the international support that would legitimize Norman intervention. His personal regimen during this crucial period combined the physical conditioning necessary for military leadership with the intellectual preparation required for managing complex political operations. Dawn exercises maintained the combat skills that would be essential for personal survival during actual campaigns, while evening studies refined the strategic understanding necessary for coordinating military action with diplomatic initiatives. The correspondence that flowed from his chambers revealed the final stages of coalition building as years of careful relationship development culminated in definitive commitments from allies who understood they were being asked to participate in enterprises that would either establish new patterns of European power or result in catastrophic failure for all involved. The summer campaigns of 1057 provided final testing opportunities for the military innovations William had been developing throughout his preparation period. Operations against rebellious barons in eastern Normandy used tactics specifically designed to replicate conditions likely to be encountered during English campaigns, while logistical exercises tested the supply systems that would be crucial for sustained foreign operations. The performance of Norman forces during these operations confirmed that years of systematic preparation had produced military capabilities superior to anything available to potential enemies. The speed and efficiency with which objectives were achieved, combined with the discipline maintained under demanding conditions, indicated that William's forces possessed the professional competence necessary for successful foreign conquest. More significantly, these campaigns revealed William's own maturation as a strategic commander, whose vision encompassed not just tactical success, but also the political objectives that gave military action its ultimate meaning. His ability to coordinate multiple types of operations while maintaining focus on long-term goals marked him as a leader capable of managing the complex challenges that would define his approaching venture. The autumn of 1057 brought intelligence reports indicating that the moment for decisive action was approaching with inexorable momentum. King Edward's condition had reached the point where his death was expected within weeks, while Harold's preparations for assuming royal authority were proceeding with efficiency that suggested delay would make foreign intervention increasingly difficult. The papal response to William's diplomatic initiatives had reached the stage where official sanctions seemed not just probable, but imminent, providing the religious legitimacy that would transform potential aggression into righteous crusade. The theological arguments that presented English conquest as spiritual reform had gained acceptance among influential church authorities who possessed the credibility to legitimize military action in the eyes of Christian Europe. Most importantly, the military capabilities that had been developing through years of intensive preparation had reached optimal levels that made previously impossible ventures appear achievable through careful execution. The Norman forces at William's disposal possessed advantages in training, equipment, leadership, and coordination that could offset the numerical superiority English defenders would enjoy on their native soil. The convergence of these favorable factors created a strategic situation that validated William's patient approach, while simultaneously creating urgencies that could not be ignored much longer. The moment toward which everything had been building was arriving, with timing that seemed to confirm divine approval for Norman enterprise. William's daily routine during the final months of 1057 reflected his recognition that the preparation phase was ending and the action phase was about to begin. Administrative responsibilities that had once required personal attention were delegated to capable subordinates, freeing him to focus on the strategic decisions that would determine whether his most ambitious dreams would become glorious reality or catastrophic nightmare. The physical conditioning that had been maintained throughout the preparation period was intensified to ensure peak performance during the demanding campaigns that lay ahead. His weapons training now emphasized not just individual combat skills, but also the leadership techniques that would be necessary for maintaining morale during the inevitable moments of crisis that would test every man's courage and commitment. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk provided increasingly detailed pictures of English vulnerabilities and preparations, information that enabled final tactical refinements while revealing the narrow window of opportunity that would soon either open completely or close forever. Harold's consolidation efforts were proceeding steadily, but had not yet reached the point where foreign challenge would become impossible. The diplomatic correspondence that had been building throughout the preparation years now focused on securing final commitments from allies whose support would prove crucial during decisive moments. The responses to these overtures determined whether Norman forces would face English resistance alone or as part of broader coalitions that could provide strategic advantages during critical phases of the campaign. As winter approached in 1057, William's morning prayers in the cold stone chapel took on new intensity as he sought divine guidance for decisions that would affect not just his personal fate, but the future of everyone who had committed their lives to his vision. The young Duke's faith, which had sustained him through years of patient preparation, now provided the spiritual foundation for enterprises that would test human capabilities to their absolute limits. The daily conferences that shaped his final preparations revealed the extraordinary complexity of the challenges he was preparing to face. Military operations would need to be coordinated with political initiatives designed to minimize resistance while maximizing legitimacy. Administrative structures would need to function effectively from the moment of conquest to prevent the chaos that had destroyed previous attempts at foreign domination. Economic policies would need to balance the requirements of rewarding followers with the necessity of maintaining popular support among conquered populations. Religious reforms would need to satisfy papal expectations while avoiding provocations that might unite English resistance around nationalist and spiritual themes. The convergence of these multiple requirements created planning challenges that had no precedent in medieval experience, requiring William to develop innovative approaches that drew upon historical examples while adapting to contemporary realities. The solutions he developed reflected the sophisticated understanding of human nature and political dynamics that had been developing throughout his years of careful preparation. The winter months of 1057 and 1058 represented the final phase of preparation before events would begin moving with momentum that would carry William inexorably toward his ultimate destiny. Every alliance he had forged, every capability he had developed, and every advantage he had gained would soon be tested in ways that would determine whether his systematic approach to conquest could succeed where others throughout history had failed. The intelligence reaching his chambers painted pictures of an English kingdom that remained formidable despite its internal divisions, while the military preparations of his own forces had reached levels that made unprecedented ventures appear achievable through skillful execution. The balance between opportunity and risk had reached the optimal point where decisive action offered the best prospects for transforming ambitious dreams into historical reality. As spring arrived in 1058, William's daily routine reflected his recognition that the moment for which he had been preparing throughout his adult life was finally approaching. The administrative details that had once consumed his attention were now handled efficiently by subordinates who understood they were supporting enterprises that would either establish new patterns of European power or result in the destruction of everything they had worked to build. The physical and intellectual preparation that had sustained him through years of patient development now culminated in readiness for challenges that would test every skill he had acquired and every relationship he had cultivated. The bastard child who had once struggled to maintain authority over rebellious vassals was preparing to challenge the most established monarchy in Western Europe. Confident that his systematic approach had created the conditions necessary for success, the correspondence that flowed from his chambers revealed final preparations for ventures that would soon transform the political landscape of medieval Europe. Allies were being positioned for coordinated action, resources were being marshaled for sustained operations, and contingency plans were being refined to address every conceivable challenge that might arise during the campaigns ahead. Most significantly, the spiritual preparation that had always been central to William's approach was reaching its culmination as he sought divine approval for enterprises that would require not just human effort, but providential support to achieve success. His faith, which had sustained him through years of patient building, now provided the foundation for confidence that he was acting as an instrument of divine will, rather than merely pursuing personal ambition. The morning of January 5th, 1066, would bring news that would transform years of careful preparation into immediate necessity, as messengers arrived bearing word that King Edward the Confessor had died and Harold Godwinson had seized the English throne. The moment that William had been preparing for throughout his adult life had finally arrived, and everything he had built would now be tested in the ultimate crucible of conquest and glory. The news that reached William's chambers that cold January morning came not through the formal diplomatic channels he had spent years cultivating, but through the breathless words of a Norman merchant who had fled England in the chaos following Edward's death. The man's hands still trembled as he described the scene at Westminster Abbey, where Harold Godwinson had moved with stunning speed to claim the crown that William believed rightfully belonged to him. Within hours of Edward's passing, Harold had assembled the Witan and secured their approval for his coronation. The ceremony had taken place on the very day of Edward's burial, a breach of protocol so audacious that it left European courts stunned by its implications. Harold understood that legitimacy in medieval politics often belonged to whoever could seize it first and defend it most effectively, and his rapid action had presented William with a fait accompli that demanded immediate response. William's reaction to this news revealed the extraordinary self-control that had been developing throughout his years of preparation. Rather than exploding in anger or rushing toward precipitous action, he spent the remainder of that day in his private chapel, seeking divine guidance for the decision that would determine whether his life's work would culminate in triumph or disaster. The prayers he offered that afternoon were not requests for easy victory, but petitions for wisdom to choose the path that would serve God's will rather than merely his own ambition. The council that convened the following morning included every major figure in Norman political and military leadership. The Great Hall at Rouen had witnessed many crucial discussions throughout its history, but none that would have consequences reaching far beyond the duchy's borders. William's presentation to his assembled nobles was masterful in its combination of legal argumentation, religious justification, and practical assessment of Norman capabilities. He began by reviewing the promises that Edward had allegedly made regarding the English succession, oaths that Harold himself had sworn during his visit to Normandy several years earlier. The legal complexities of these claims were less important than their psychological effect on nobles who needed justification for the enormous risks they were being asked to accept. William understood that men would fight more effectively if they believed they were defending legitimate rights rather than pursuing naked conquest. The religious dimension of his argument proved equally compelling, as William presented Harold's rapid coronation as evidence of spiritual corruption that demanded divine correction. The English Church's resistance to continental reform movements provided theological grounds for intervention, while papal support offered legitimacy that would be crucial for maintaining moral authority throughout the challenges ahead. But it was William's analysis of practical military considerations that ultimately convinced skeptical nobles that the enterprise was feasible rather than suicidal. His intelligence networks had provided detailed assessments of English defensive capabilities, revealing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by forces trained in Norman tactical innovations. The professional discipline of his army, combined with advantages in cavalry techniques and coordinated operations, offered realistic prospects for success against English forces that relied primarily on traditional militia systems. The response from his assembled followers revealed both the loyalty William had earned through years of effective leadership and the ambitious spirit that characterized Norman culture. One by one, the great nobles of the duchy pledged their support for the English venture, offering not just military service, but substantial financial contributions that would help fund the massive logistical requirements of cross-channel invasion. The weeks that followed transformed Normandy into a vast military workshop as preparations accelerated with intensity that amazed contemporary observers. The forests echoed with the sound of axes as thousands of trees were felled to provide timber for the fleet that would carry Norman forces across the treacherous waters of the English Channel. Coastal shipyards that had never attempted construction on such a scale worked day and night to build vessels capable of transporting horses, supplies, and siege equipment, in addition to the thousands of warriors who would comprise the invasion force. William's daily routine during this period reflected his hands-on approach to leadership that had always distinguished him from rulers who preferred to delegate crucial responsibilities to subordinates. His mornings began before dawn with inspections of shipbuilding progress, where he personally examined construction techniques and questioned master craftsmen about their estimates for completion schedules. These visits served multiple purposes, demonstrating his commitment to the enterprise while ensuring that quality standards were maintained despite the pressure for rapid production. The afternoon hours were devoted to military preparations that tested every aspect of Norman readiness for the unprecedented challenges ahead. Training exercises involving thousands of participants explored tactics for amphibious landings, rapid deployment of cavalry forces, and coordination between different types of troops under battlefield conditions. William's personal participation in these exercises maintained his physical conditioning, while providing opportunities to assess the capabilities and limitations of individual commanders who would bear crucial responsibilities during actual operations. The evening conferences that shaped strategic planning revealed the extraordinary complexity of the enterprise William was orchestrating. Military operations would need to be synchronized with diplomatic initiatives designed to minimize English resistance while maximizing international support. Supply systems would need to function effectively across hostile territory, where local populations might provide either assistance or opposition, depending upon Norman treatment of civilian populations. The intelligence reports that crossed William's desk painted increasingly detailed pictures of English preparations as Harold recognized that foreign invasion was not just possible, but probable. Coastal fortifications were being strengthened, militia forces were being mobilized, and diplomatic overtures were being made to potential allies who might provide assistance against Norman aggression. The race between Norman preparation and English defensive measures would largely determine whether the invasion succeeded through surprise or faced determined resistance from the moment of landing. The papal response to William's diplomatic initiatives exceeded his most optimistic expectations as church authorities moved from cautious support toward active endorsement of Norman intervention. The banner blessed by Pope Alexander II that arrived at Rouen in late spring provided not just symbolic approval, but practical legitimacy that would prove invaluable for maintaining morale during difficult moments while undermining English claims to divine favor. The financial demands of the enterprise strained Norman resources to their limits, despite careful economic planning that had been developing throughout the preparation period. The cost of building ships, purchasing supplies, and equipping thousands of warriors exceeded the annual revenues of most medieval kingdoms, requiring innovative approaches to funding that drew upon every available source of wealth within the duchy and beyond. William's solution involved creating what amounted to a joint stock company for conquest, with participants contributing resources in exchange for shares of anticipated profits from successful invasion. Norman nobles mortgaged estates to finance their contributions, while foreign adventurers brought their own resources in hope of gaining lands and titles in conquered England. The result was a financial partnership that distributed both risks and potential rewards among hundreds of stakeholders who would have powerful incentives to ensure the venture's success. The recruitment efforts that accompanied financial preparations attracted warriors from throughout Europe who recognized that service to William offered opportunities for advancement that were unavailable elsewhere. Breton knights seeking to escape the limitations of their mountainous homeland joined Norman cavalry units, while Flemish infantry brought specialized skills that complemented traditional Norman military strengths. Italian adventurers, German mercenaries, and French nobles all contributed to an international force that reflected William's reputation as a leader capable of achieving the impossible. The summer months of 1066 brought the final phase of preparation as Norman forces assembled along the coast near Dives-sur-Mer. The sight of thousands of warriors, hundreds of ships, and vast quantities of supplies concentrated in a relatively small area created an atmosphere of barely contained excitement mixed with understandable apprehension about the challenges ahead. William's presence among his troops during this period was constant and conspicuous, as he understood that maintaining morale would be crucial for success during the demanding operations that lay ahead. His daily routine during the assembly period combined the practical requirements of military leadership with the psychological needs of men who were preparing to risk everything for uncertain rewards. Morning inspections of equipment and supplies demonstrated his attention to details that could determine survival during actual combat, while evening addresses to assembled troops provided opportunities to reinforce the religious and legal justifications that made their enterprise righteous rather than merely ambitious. The delays caused by unfavourable winds tested both Norman patience and William's leadership skills as weeks passed without the weather conditions necessary for safe channel crossing. The assembled forces consumed supplies at rates that strained logistical systems, while prolonged waiting created opportunities for doubt and dissension among warriors who had expected rapid action rather than extended uncertainty. William's response to these challenges revealed the psychological insight that had been developing throughout his years of leadership. Rather than allowing frustration to build among idle troops, he organized competitions and exercises that maintained readiness while providing entertainment that kept spirits high. Religious services led by chaplains who emphasized divine timing reinforced the belief that God would provide favorable conditions when the moment was right for righteous action. The intelligence that reached the Norman camp during this waiting period painted an increasingly complex picture of English preparations and political developments that would affect invasion prospects. Harold's position as king was being challenged by his brother Tostig, who had allied with Norwegian forces under King Harold Hardrada in preparation for their own invasion attempt from the north. This development offered William both opportunities and dangers, as English forces divided between multiple threats might be more vulnerable to Norman attack, but successful coordination between different invasion forces could prove difficult to achieve. The news that Harold Hardrada had landed in northern England with a substantial Norwegian army created the strategic opportunity that William had been hoping for throughout the summer. Harold Godwinson would be forced to march north with his best troops to confront this immediate threat, leaving southern England vulnerable to Norman invasion if timing could be coordinated properly. William's response to this development demonstrated the strategic flexibility that had characterized his approach throughout the preparation period. Rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined plans, he adapted his operational schedule to exploit the opportunities created by Norwegian intervention while maintaining readiness for immediate action when weather conditions permitted channel crossing. The morning of September 27th brought the favourable winds that Norman forces had been awaiting throughout the summer. William's reaction to this long-anticipated development revealed both the careful preparation that had preceded this moment and the decisive leadership that would be necessary for success during the challenging days ahead. Orders flowed from his headquarters with efficiency that reflected months of detailed planning, while the organised chaos of embarkation demonstrated the professional competence that Norman military reforms had produced. His personal preparations for the crossing reflected the dual nature of his role as both supreme commander and individual warrior who would face personal danger during the battles ahead. The armour he donned that morning had been crafted by the finest metalworkers in Normandy, combining protection with mobility in ways that reflected centuries of military innovation. The sword at his side had been blessed by papal legates and Norman bishops, carrying spiritual authority that complemented its practical effectiveness as a weapon of war. The prayers he offered before boarding his flagship were both personal petitions for divine protection and public demonstrations of faith that would inspire confidence among followers who understood they were embarking upon enterprises that would test human capabilities to their absolute limits. His words carried across the assembled fleet through the crisp autumn air, reaching thousands of warriors who found strength in their leader's certainty that God favoured their cause. The crossing itself proved less challenging than many had feared, with favourable winds and calm seas that seemed to confirm divine approval for Norman enterprise. William's flagship led the way across waters that had defeated previous invasion attempts, while the discipline maintained by his forces during the voyage demonstrated the professional training that distinguished his army from conventional medieval military organizations. The landing at Pevensey Bay on September 28th marked the culmination of years of preparation and the beginning of the most crucial phase of William's extraordinary career. His first steps on English soil were taken with full awareness that he had committed everything he had built in Normandy to an enterprise that would either establish him among history's greatest conquerors or destroy the life's work that had brought him to this moment of ultimate destiny. The beachhead that Norman forces established during their first hours on English territory reflected both careful advance planning and the adaptability that would prove essential during the challenging campaign ahead. Fortifications were constructed using prefabricated materials transported across the channel, while scouts fanned out across the surrounding countryside to gather intelligence about English defensive preparations and local political sentiment. William's personal conduct during these crucial first hours revealed the leadership qualities that had enabled him to inspire such extraordinary loyalty among diverse followers who had risked everything to support his ambitions. His calm assessment of tactical situations, combined with visible concern for the welfare of individual soldiers, created confidence that spread throughout the army, despite the obvious dangers they faced in hostile territory. The news that reached the Norman camp within days of landing confirmed that Harold Godwinson had achieved decisive victory over Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge, eliminating one threat while simultaneously creating new urgencies for Norman operations. Harold's success demonstrated his military capabilities, while also indicating that he would soon be marching south with battle-tested troops who had just proven their effectiveness against formidable opponents. William's response to this intelligence revealed the strategic thinking that would characterize his approach throughout the English campaign. Rather than seeking to avoid battle with Harold's approaching forces, he chose to position his army in ways that would force the English king to fight under conditions that favoured Norman tactical advantages. The decision to remain near the coast while establishing fortified positions demonstrated confidence in Norman military superiority that would prove crucial for maintaining morale during the decisive confrontation ahead. The site chosen for this confrontation would be a ridge near Hastings, where Norman forces could utilise their cavalry effectively while forcing English troops to attack uphill against prepared positions. The battlefield that William selected for what would become one of history's most famous military encounters reflected both tactical genius and strategic understanding of the psychological factors that would determine victory or defeat. The psychological factors that would determine victory or defeat. The dawn of October 14th, 1066 broke grey and cold over the Sussex countryside, and William rose in his tent before the first light touched the horizon. His squires moved quietly around him as they helped him into the layers that would define this day. First came the padded gambeson, its quilted surface designed to absorb the shock of blows that might penetrate his mail. Then the hauberk itself, thousands of iron rings linked by Norman armourers, whose craft had been perfected through generations of warfare. As his attendants worked, William's mind was already moving through the tactical considerations that would shape the coming battle. Harold's army had arrived during the night, taking position along the ridge that the English called Senlac Hill. The reports from his scouts painted a picture of a formidable defensive line, with Harold's houseguards forming the centre and local militia filling out the flanks. The dragon banner of Wessex flew prominently above the English position, a symbol of authority that William intended to capture before the sun set. His morning meal was simple fare, bread and watered wine consumed while reviewing the final dispositions of his forces. The Norman army had been arranged in 3 divisions, with Bretons on the left, Normans in the centre, and French allies on the right. Each division combined cavalry, infantry, and archers in proportions that reflected years of tactical innovation and battlefield experience. The sound of horns echoing across the valley announced the beginning of Norman preparations, as thousands of warriors began their own morning rituals. Some knelt in prayer before makeshift altars, seeking divine protection for the hours ahead. Others checked weapons and equipment with methodical care. understanding that survival might depend upon details that seemed trivial in peaceful moments. William's personal preparations included receiving final intelligence about English dispositions from scouts who had spent the night observing Harold's camp. The English king had positioned his forces along the ridge in a defensive formation that would require Norman attackers to advance uphill against prepared positions. The tactical challenge was formidable, but William had spent years developing solutions to exactly these types of problems. His warhorse, a massive destrier bred for the demands of medieval combat, stood ready with equipment that reflected both practical necessity and symbolic importance. The saddle was high-backed to provide security during mounted combat, while the bridle and reins allowed precise control during the intricate maneuvers that characterized Norman cavalry tactics. The animal's training had been as intensive as that of its rider, creating a partnership that functioned with almost supernatural coordination. As the morning mist began to lift, William mounted his horse and rode among his assembled forces, speaking words of encouragement that carried clearly in the crisp air. His presence among the troops served multiple purposes, demonstrating his willingness to share their dangers while reinforcing the chain of command that would be essential for coordinated action during the chaos of battle. The religious ceremony that preceded the advance was conducted by Bishop Odo, William's half-brother, whose blessing carried both spiritual authority and family solidarity. The papal banner that flew above Norman forces provided visible reminder of divine approval, while the relics sewn into William's own banners offered protection that transcended mere military preparation. The advance toward the English position began with the measured pace of professional soldiers who understood that energy expended too early might not be available when most needed. Norman archers led the way, their role to weaken English formations before the decisive cavalry charge that would determine the battle's outcome. Behind them marched the infantry, who would exploit any gaps created by mounted attacks, while the cavalry themselves waited for the optimal moment to unleash the coordinated charge that was their specialty. William's position during these opening phases allowed him to observe the entire battlefield while remaining ready to intervene at crucial moments. His elevated vantage point revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both armies, information that would guide the tactical decisions determining success or failure during the critical hours ahead. And so we close this chapter of one man's extraordinary journey, a bastard child who transformed himself into the architect of a new England. Through countless dawns spent in prayer, afternoons mastering the arts of war, and evenings navigating the treacherous currents of medieval politics, William had forged himself into an instrument of destiny. His story reminds us that greatness often emerges not from privilege, but from the relentless pursuit of purpose against impossible odds. Rest well, knowing that some dreams, pursued with unwavering determination, truly can reshape the world.